Hello and welcome to Scripture Untangled, a podcast by the Canadian Bible Society. My name is Joanna LaFleur. I'm a friend of the Canadian Bible Society, and I'm going to be your guide for today's episode. Today, seasoned journalist Lorna Dueck will be speaking with English author and social critic Os Guinness. Os Guinness is the great-great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the Dublin brewer, and he was born in China in World War II, where his parents were medical missionaries at that time. Os was a witness to the climax of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. He was expelled with many other foreigners in 1951, and then he returned to England, where he was educated there in England. He completed his undergraduate degree at the University of London and his Doctor of Philosophy in Social Sciences at Oxford. Os has written or edited more than 30 books, and his latest book is The Great Quest: Invitation to the Examined Life and a Sure Path to Meaning, published in 2022. Os has spoken at many of the world's major universities and spoken widely to political and business conferences around the world. He now lives with his wife Jenny in Washington, D.C. Enjoy this conversation.
Os Guinness, thank you for coming back to the Canadian Bible Society. By popular demand, we're just delighted to hear more about the anniversary edition of The Call. There must have been, you have so many publications that you write for and with. Why an anniversary edition?
Well, this is undoubtedly the bestseller of all my books. And it certainly grows, I think, from the heart of faith, but also something that's been very personal for me, because when I discovered the notion of calling, it was like almost as liberating as my conversion itself. But that's another story. So this is a book that means everything to me.
Okay, well, then you can't just throw a teaser like that out there. When did you discover the notion of the call?
Well, I came to faith in 1960 after an intellectual journey, reading atheists and C.S. Lewis and others and so on. But at that time in London, I went to London University, there was almost an unspoken idea that if you were, quote, all out for Jesus, you were designed for the ministry or evangelism or the mission field. Well, my parents are missionaries. I knew enough about that one to know that wasn't me. And so when I finished college, I thought, well, maybe I should become an evangelist. It was the heyday of Billy Graham in England. And I had a rather comic attempt in Northern Ireland. I was invited to lead a mission. And the first night I happened to read from the New English Bible, which was a new translation just out then in the 60s. And Ian Paisley's supporters boycotted it because it wasn't the King James, the authorized version. And so nobody could get into the mission after that. So I thought, well, that was my attempt at evangelism in that big way. So it must be the ministry. And I went for 9 months to a church, and I loved the people, and I enjoyed things like preaching, but I hated it, and I couldn't say why. And one day I had an old car. It was a 1927 car, 40 years old, in the 60s. I took it into the only garage that could loft. You had to crank it by hand and so on, and had a wonderful conversation with the garage attendant. And at the end of it, I got back in the car, cranked the handle, and I realized he was the first non-Christian I'd spoken to in several weeks, because the church, wonderful though it was a womb-to-tomb subculture. That was my frustration. I love all that's going on in society and culture, the arts and so on. Here we were in a world of the Beatles and Ingmar Bergman films and the radicals, and they were not in touch with any of that. And I expressed my frustrations to one of the elders, and he gave me a Xerox copy of William Perkins' A Treatise on Calling, 16th century. It was terrific. And I realized everything I'd been taught was wrong. And I had to follow the call of the Lord that was the call for me. And I had to do that which was me, and not necessarily become a minister or an evangelist or a missionary. And so that for me was an incredibly liberating moment And I've, through the book, helped many, many people since then have that same experience of the freedom of knowing what they are.
Well, you do have the book revolve around the fact that every person has the desire, just like you did at that frustrated post at that church. They've got the desire to know I'm living out the purpose of my life. In your opinion and experience, what characterizes someone who is fulfilling their purpose in life?
Well, if you think human beings all need three things: meaning, we've got to make sense of the world; belonging, we've got to find security and a place in life; and then purpose, because we are purpose-driven people. We want to be fulfilled and do that for why we're here. And so that's incredibly important. And of course, the answer to each of those is the same thing: faith. And our faith in Jesus gives us the deepest answers. You can see the same things in Judaism, because the call is an idea which is there for the Jewish people as well as for those of us who are followers of Jesus. So it answers those very, very deep desires and longings.
So, what does a person on God's purpose look like?
Well, you have an overarching direction to almost everything you do in so many areas. You know why you're doing it. It has purpose. You know, when I worked to the Trinity Forum, again and again, you got the businessman's, I climbed the ladder of success, put up against the wrong wall. And that's just one example of people who work hard with very limited goals, and they don't add up to what they hope. And then they start out in their 20s and 30s and do incredible things. I remember talking to an Olympic athlete, and she'd had 5 gold medals. But then in her 20s was deeply depressed and feeling actually suicidal. Because if life was simply winning a gold medal, she had 70 years of life left when she couldn't do what she did in athletics. And so she was deeply depressed. You need an overarching goal that is big enough to include everything you do in life and give it a profound sense of purpose. And that's what our calling in Jesus means.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit, because gold Olympic medals or business success or just getting by, the ladder is leaning on the wrong wall. You want us to first and foremost get ourselves anchored into, we are creatures created by God, designed to be in relationship with Jesus. Explain that a bit, how that connects to my vocational call.
Well, vocation is just a Latin-rooted word, which means calling. So vocation, you actually mean occupational call. But you think from Abraham onwards, the heart of faith has been following the call. Of course, the climax is Jesus. Follow me, follow me, follow me, he says, and people get up and follow him. So following him means that all that we are, our very being, all that we have, our possessions, all that we do, our actions, have this dynamic and this direction, because they're now being done as unto him, as an answer to his call, which is absolutely terrific in 100 different ways. I had trouble with the chapters, closing them off. Could have gone on and on and on. There were so many things that calling made a difference in, but I had to close them off. The most famous chapter in the book is probably the one that we live before one audience, an audience of one. Now, if everyone thinks they all have audiences, our families, our clients, people who listen to you in the podcast, doctors have patients, you go on down the line. But for the one who follows the call, there is ultimately one audience above every other audience. And that makes a terrific difference in terms of how we understand success and so on.
So let's just put a younger Lorna in front of you, immensely frustrated with career choices, immensely worried and concerned. What would it have looked like if I could have just do you stop worrying about that and just say, well, I'll just float along and wait for Jesus to open a door?
No, it's not sitting around, because part of calling is do what you are, as I call it. In other words, the exercise, the gifts God has given us, natural gifts. So you think of a coach in athletics. A coach draws out the talents, whatever they are, in the people he's coaching, soccer or baseball or whatever it is. In the same way, I think parents and teachers should be drawing out of teenagers the idea they have certain gifts. So that's the age it should be started to be taught well. Then, of course, the 20s are, generally speaking, the era of trial and error. You leave college and there may be 6 things you could do. You're aware of your gifts. You might fit 6 different career possibilities. Well, a lot of people try one and then another. No, that's not them. That's not me. Can't see myself doing this the whole of my life. But most people, you need by your 30s to be settled down to really know who you are. Now, when I say do what you are, that's a privileged way of putting it. Because in most of history, and in much of the world today, people had to do what their fathers and mothers did, and their grandfathers and grandmothers did. They had zero choice. But in a middle-class society and higher, one privilege is we can discover who we are, the gifts we have, and choose jobs and careers that are in line with our gifts. People who don't, they find themselves square pegs in round holes, facing a midlife crisis later on.
In fact, you write, I think it's the way you've worded it is you say, to find work that perfectly fits our callings is not a right, but a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
Any practical ways for how we can find that blessing of work that fits our call?
Well, again, I think it's, through friends and through parents and through self-reflection, we realize we're good at certain things, we're not good at others. My son is a natural businessman, entrepreneur. I'm not. My gifts are all in ideas and speaking and communication and that sort of thing. My wife jokes that she doesn't trust me to change the light bulbs. Now, her father, my esteemed father-in-law, he made cars for Indianapolis. He was brilliant with his hands. I'm an absolute dummy with my hands. That's not my gift. In other words, we each need to know who we are and the gifts we have, and that's what we want to serve the Lord and our neighbors with.
And you've already referenced getting the counsel of others around us is part of discovering a calling, isn't it?
Yeah. I say to people, why don't you just write down what you think are 3 or 4 of your central gifts that make you really happy when you're doing them? Not a question of being paid well or being applauded, but you're doing them, you're really happy, that's you. And then when you thought about that for a while, show that to those closest to you, maybe your parents or your best friends. Now, in most cases, they'll say, of course, that's sort of obviously you. Mm-hmm. In some cases, they'll say, what? Do you think really that's your gift? Because some people have odd ideas of what's really they're best at. But it's good to get, we're not swayed by them. No, we're praying before the Lord. We've got to do the wrestling. But we are helped by them.
And yet, I was very convicted as I worked through your book, The Call, is that there's a higher calling, there's a higher profession on our lives than simply the tasks and where I show up for my paid employment or even my passionate hobbies. And that is, I'm first a follower of Jesus. That's a call, isn't it? That is the call.
That is the call.
The following Jesus.
You probably know I'm named, I don't like the name. I was named after Oswald Chambers.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It turned out he was a friend of my grandparents. I've never liked the name, but I loved the fact once when I met his daughter, she told me he hated the name too. Anyway, the name doesn't matter. You probably know his great book, My Utmost or Highest.
Yes.
There was the wonder of calling. William Tyndale talks about changing nappies. Martin Luther talks about washing dishes. Brother Lawrence is the practice of the presence in the kitchen. But all of them, it can be the humdrum things, the menial things, they have to be done too. But we're doing them as unto the Lord. So Hudson Taylor put it wonderfully, a little thing is a little thing. But faithfulness in a little thing is a big thing. And that's big when you're doing things that matter when nobody sees, because you know you're doing it for the Lord and not to be seen or to be applauded or to be paid extra or whatever. We have one audience, the audience of one.
Okay, I'm going to quote here from the book, because you call that the primary calling to be a follower of Christ. The second is a calling to live, think, speak, and act for God as our sovereign. And this heart posture should direct your vocational calling. That is going to
Occupational. No,
okay.
Occupational.
Occupational. Your occupational, sorry.
I'm challenging you to clear up your language, Lorna.
Okay, not okay.
Vocation is simply another word for calling. So people have talked about a vocational calling. That's simply a calling.
Okay, so let's suppose I'm a nurse. I show up in that that occupation, act vocationally as Christ would have me do it. To act for God as my sovereign in that shift, in that demanding shift. What do you do when it's just not going well? When there's things that are going to just be in conflict? Like when your boss wants you to cut a corner, or it's just not possible to be nice to all the people that are demanding your skill.
Yeah. Well, living before the audience of one means at the end of the day, we only look for approval from one. So that's challenging sometimes, comforting sometimes. You and I do a lot with public communications, and you can be roundly rejected or openly attacked, and you have to take courage in making a stand, because you know you're doing it before the Lord. You have that one audience that matters, even if you lose certain other audiences. And so it's a constant challenge. Of course, it's put very simply, we're called to be faithful, not successful. And that means we're living before that one audience. Now, you mentioned nurses. What an incredible sphere to show a high view of humanness and therefore respect, compassion for people at their weakness. Nurses are wonderful people. My mother was a surgeon, so I know a little bit about the medical world, but it's a wonderful sphere. Now, the same is true of lawyers. You're not just there for billable hours. You're fundamentally there for justice. And that's a high calling in a world which is increasingly corrupt and power-driven and anything but justice-oriented, and gone down the line. Now, there are some areas it's very hard to think through what doing it before the Lord will really mean. I worked when I was a teenager in a factory literally with rigids, and that was much, much harder.
Taking a moment out of the conversation with Oz Guinness to tell you about the Bible course, because whether you're a seasoned Bible reader or you're just starting on the journey, the Bible course offers a superb overview of the world's best-selling book, that is, the Bible. This 8-session course will help you grow in your understanding of the Bible, and using a unique storyline, the Bible course shows you how key events, books, and characters all fit together. It's great for in-person groups or digital gatherings. You can use it wherever you like. You can watch the first session for free and review the accompanying course guide. Go to biblecourse.ca to learn more. That's biblecourse.ca, and the link will be down in the show notes. Now back to the conversation.
Well, and I think there are times in our life, there are occupations where you have to leave it. You have to depart because it is not vocationally honoring to God. Am I right in that? There are seasons?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the more our culture is slipping away, and Canada's slipping away as fast as any of the Western nations, sadly, clearly what we all need is courage. And courage is always put the first of the virtues, because all the other virtues needed if you're to stand by them. If you're to be honest or loyal or whatever, you need courage. And certainly we need courage today. So calling, the fact we're doing things before the Lord.
Yeah, I can remember, our kids are long gone, but I can remember 3 times in my career of being a journalist where I had to leave work because my career was getting in the way of my calling of being a godly mother. And there were some things happening in the home that just required more attention.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of stuff happens, right? You have to make the tough calls in whatever profession you may be in. We just had a phenomenal conference in Canada on the growth of euthanasia in our country and the crisis medical workers are facing. Sometimes there are places where you have to draw the line in the sand and say, I can't participate in this.
No, that's right. And I think that's going to face Christians across the whole of the Western world more. But if we don't stand with courage now, the acceleration and the degeneration will be faster than ever. So we need to stand. I think I love the fact that calling, the whole biblical view of leadership, for example, the leader is not just the person at the top, the president, the general, the CEO, whatever. The leader is everyone in their sphere, at their level, taking the initiative and the responsibility to do what needs to be done. That's all of us. And I may have said this before, and the last time I was with you, I love the Jewish admiration for Nahshon. Now, if you look in the Bible, he doesn't have much of a place. I think he's Aaron's son-in-law, but he is mentioned. But in Jewish tradition, he was the first man who went into the Red Sea. In other words, the Lord told Moses to raise his staff and he would send a wind and the waters would pile up. But when they did, everyone looked, who's going to go first after you, Claude? But Nahshon, if the Lord had said, he strode in. And the Jewish story is the waters were up to his neck before they started to subside, but then they did, and everyone followed him. And you have this high view of leadership. It's everyone at their level, in their sphere, taking the initiative for doing what needs to be done. And of course, as you're saying, with courage. And that's what makes us salty and light-bearing. Or the historians talk about when culture is in crisis, they need a creative minority, a remnant, but not just a negative remnant, complaining and so on, a positive remnant standing against the tide with courage. That's what calling does.
Well, that's beautiful. And it's not always so glamorous as being the first one into the Red Sea. Sometimes it's just showing up, isn't it? And showing up with joy, with a smile, to wipe tables, pour coffee, whatever your profession may find you at. It's sometimes just a great attitude, a biblical attitude, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. In the book, you state that when Jesus calls us to follow him, all that contradicts his call, all that contradicts his lordship over all our lives has to go. What did that look like in your own life, Oz?
But I grew up in the 60s, which is a very permissive, liberated, free world. And you soon realize, for instance, there's a simple principle in freedom. Freedom is obedience to the unenforceable. It's when you do what is right because it's right, or stand for something that's true because it's true, and not because there's a sanction or a popularity or any groundswell for or against it. Not at all. That's always been a tough one for 60s people because, we were given too much freedom in all sorts of areas. In some areas are rather obvious, like, say, sexual things, that they were wrong. But generally speaking, we were given too much freedom. And that idea that freedom is obedience to the unenforceable. And you had to do it because it's right and good.
Wow.
That was
Well,
a tough one.
in a world in this generation where there are no boundaries and there's limitless ability to access any ideas and anything you want electronically all the time,
Hmm.
you more than ever, you need that inner calling, don't you? That
Yes,
inner
exactly.
compass. Okay. Let's get onto this word of purpose because it comes up a lot in the call. What does purpose mean?
A purpose is what you're doing in what you're doing. What's the end or the goal or the objective behind what you're doing? Because everything fits into a sense of a whole. If you're preparing a meal, you cut the carrots. It's obviously to prepare a stew to feed your family or whatever. And you can think everything is like Chinese boxes within boxes. They grow bigger and bigger and bigger as you see the ultimate goal that life has. And that's what calling does, because it gives us an ultimate goal and everything fits into it in a most wonderful way. So nothing is too trivial. Nothing is meaningless.
Have you ever seen that turn sour? Have you ever seen this idealistic pursuit of purpose in the call concept turn sour?
In what?
Like in the pursuit of like nothing is meaningless because it
Mhm.
all has purpose. Have you seen it turn sour on someone? Have you seen it go south?
No, and not at all. I think, on the contrary, it's people who don't have a sense of calling that what they do goes south. In other words, they don't have a high enough purpose so that everything fits into it. And I love, again, Oswald Chambers, my utmost for his highest. So there can't be anything I do anywhere in life, wherever I go, whatever I'm doing, that should not fit in some way to God's calling in my life, my utmost for his highest. Now, as we all do that together, millions and millions of followers of Jesus, silently, quietly, faithfully doing their thing as unto him, then you've got a huge community of people glorifying the Lord by the way they live. And the effect is huge. Now, my little doing it, maybe your little doing it, don't add up to much by themselves. But when a family does it, a community does it, the church at large does it as followers of Jesus, then it becomes really salty and light bearing.
It's just beautiful to think of that filter going over everything practical in our lives. Is this glorifying God? And if it's not, it gets knocked off the shelf, doesn't it? It's just
Mm-hmm.
you delete it.
But then to ask, how is this? I mean, if you're writing a spreadsheet economically, that's pretty dry and boring. At least it would be for me. But you have to sort of think through, how is my life fitting into all this? Yes, we're doing it to make money and I'm helping my family and also, but it's worthwhile thinking through deeper issues all the time so that your life is invigorated with purpose.
We are having this discussion at a time when inflation has skyrocketed in Canada and families are in a housing crisis. How do we filter this through economic stress?
Well, my parents in China in the 1930s, literally one of those times where people came in with barrowfuls of cash because the inflation was over 1,000%. So when my dad, who was a director for the mission of a certain region, when he got money, he had to immediately turn it into money and take it around to everyone who needed it, because maybe in a day or two it would be even less worthwhile than when he got it. Now, one of the challenges in all that was simply trust in the Lord. So we lived through famine, rampant inflation, disease. I think I told you my brothers died in a terrible famine. I was there in the first 2 years of the Chinese Revolution. But I would say, looking back, what I learned most from my parents was trust. God is greater than all. God can be trusted in all situations. Have no fear. Have faith in God. Now, in other words, no panic, no insecurity. Down here in America, there's so many Christians are fearful. panicking culturally as if somehow the decline of America means that God's sovereignty is being clipped. Nonsense. I think trust is the basic thing, whatever happens, with a quiet contentment. Now, we've got to do much more than that, but trust is basic.
Well, I'm sure there are many situations going through the minds of our listeners right now where trust is, it's one of the most challenging ways in which to apply the calling. Like, stay the course. God is more in control than the circumstances you see. That's part of the calling, isn't it?
Oh, very much so.
All right. What have I missed? Anything? We're almost out of time here, Oz. Anything else you'd like to say about the anniversary edition of challenging people to really lock into God's calling for their life?
Well, Lorna, one of the least popular ones is, you think back, the first responder to a call is Abraham. And when he's called, Genesis 12:1, the first word is negative, leave. He's told to break with his country, his culture, and his kin. The three social forces shape us all. In other words, from then onwards, certainly with our Lord, we're in the world, but we're not of the world. Those who follow Jesus are called to be countercultural. We're members of the city of God, not the city of man. St. Augustine. Paul, don't be conformed, but transformed. Now, that's a tough one today, because both in Canada and the US and the UK, we're living in cultures that were once Christian. And it's always harder to be countercultural in a culture you think that has been Christian. And so we need to regain that countercultural stance. Are we being faithful to the word or to the world? The American church, huge in numbers still, but it's very weak because it's worldly. It's been shaped more by American culture than by the gospel. And so part of calling today is to recover that countercultural stance, which again is part of faithfulness.
Well, what a good reminder. What a good reminder that God's call is not always the culture's call. Seldom is the same. All right. Oz Guinness, thank you so much for putting out an anniversary edition of The Call, for spending this time with the Canadian Bible Society. Thank you very much for all you're doing.
My pleasure. I'm so glad the work you're doing. And it's sad to see Canada drifting from its Jewish and Christian roots. And I hope Christians will be a creative minority, and they certainly will be if they're faithful to Jesus and follow his call.